The doors of the Redemption Gulch Saloon swung open with a violent groan, slicing through the low-hanging smoke and silencing the out-of-tune piano. The men inside, a collection of weary prospectors and hard-bitten ranchers, looked up from their whiskey, their faces momentarily illuminated by the blinding slab of afternoon sun. The man who stood silhouetted there was not large, but he carried an aura of chilling purpose that seemed to suck the warmth from the room. His name was Jedediah Kane, and he moved with the unnerving grace of a hunting wolf stepping into a sheep pen. His long duster was coated in the dust of 1,000 vengeful miles, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sky, swept over every soul in the room before landing on the tarnished star pinned to Sheriff Brody's chest. Kane strode to the bar and dropped a heavy leather pouch of coins onto the scarred wood, the sound a dull thud of indisputable authority. "I'm looking for a woman." His voice was like gravel and ice, cutting through the sudden quiet. "A killer who calls herself Clara Vance. She didn't just murder my brother, Sheriff. She butchered him, lured a good, simple man to his doom, and left him to die on a cold floor." He leaned in, his whisper carrying with venomous clarity across the room, turning every man present into a juror. "I hear she's found a hole to hide in, protected by a man I once knew. Elias Thorne." A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. Figures. Thorne always did have a misplaced sense of honor. A failing that cost better men their lives during the war. A failing I intend to correct personally. Judge Gideon Price arrives in 1 month. He's an old family friend, and he appreciates swift justice. I expect her in chains and the gallows ready by then. So, you tell me, Sheriff, where do I find the ghost who wears a sack over her head? Sevens. Part 1. The Silent Contract. The forest was the only church Elias Thorne attended. Its towering pines were his pillars, the wind sighing through the needles his only sermon. For 5 years since the war had spat him out, a hollowed shell of the man he'd been, this patch of Oregon wilderness was his sanctuary and his prison. He lived in a world of timber, iron, and silence, the rhythmic thud of his axe, a conversation with the ghosts that followed him from the battlefields of the East. The screams from Gettysburg were quieter here, the face of Corporal Samuel Vance less vivid in the dappled sunlight. But even a hermit needed salt, flour, and blasting powder, and the journey to Redemption Gulch was a penance he paid with the turning of the seasons. He hated the town, its grasping, noisy humanity, the way its citizens' eyes slid over the puckered scar on his neck. This time, the air in town felt different, heavier. A tension coiled in the dust, thick as tobacco smoke. He saw it in the way men gathered in tight, whispering knots, their glances darting towards the sheriff's office. He'd seen the reason on his way in. A notice, freshly nailed, announcing the imminent arrival of a circuit judge. And he'd seen the man responsible for the unease. Jedediah Kane, seated on the porch of the saloon as if he owned it, his gray eyes missing nothing. Elias had kept his head down, his hat pulled low, but he felt Kane's gaze on him, a cold prickle of recognition that spanned 5 years and 1,000 miles of blood-soaked ground. He remembered Kane's chilling words from the war, after a botched retreat. "There are debts that are only ever paid in blood, Thorne." The memory spurred Elias to finish his business quickly. He was loading the last sack of flour onto his mule when a commotion from the livery yard snagged his attention, a sound of coarse laughter and jeering that grated on his already frayed nerves. A crowd had formed a crude semicircle, their faces, etched with the dull hardships of the frontier, now alight with a cruel, feverish curiosity. On a makeshift stage of barrels and planks stood the auctioneer, a man whose smile never reached his cold, calculating eyes. Beside him stood a figure that made Elias's breath catch. A woman, her hands bound with frayed twine, a coarse burlap sack pulled over her entire head and tied tight at the neck. She was utterly still, a statue of degradation, her bare feet dusty on the rough wood. Beneath the hem of a stained and tattered dress, he could see angry red welts on her ankles. Elias felt a familiar, bitter bile rise in his throat, the taste of helplessness in the face of casual brutality, a taste he knew intimately from the war, from watching men become monsters. "Last lot of the day, gentlemen," the auctioneer bellowed, projecting a false cheer. "Property of a debtor, now passed on to settle his accounts. Can't tell you her name, and as you can see, she ain't keen on showing her face. But she's got a strong back for work, and she'll obey. I guarantee it. A wife for the lonely man. We start the bidding at $2. A wave of jeering laughter, sharp and ugly, rolled through the crowd. "Might be a hag under there," one man shouted. "Or worse, might be one of the sheriff's old mistakes." Another cackled, earning a glare from Brody, who stood watching from the edge, his face a mask of weary resignation. The woman didn't flinch. Elias, a student of survival, watched her hands. Her fingers, stained with dirt, twitched, curled into a fist for a single, defiant heartbeat, then slowly, deliberately, relaxed. It was a minuscule act of rebellion in a universe of humiliation, and it struck him like a physical blow. He saw not property, but a soldier holding a broken line. He thought of the man on the saloon porch, Jedediah Kane, and the venom in his voice as he hunted a woman who wore a sack. This was her. The ghost. Samuel Vance's accused killer. $2. A bargain for a lifetime of obedience. Is there a man here brave enough, or drunk enough, to take a chance? The auctioneer taunted. The crowd shuffled, their amusement beginning to curdle into impatience. The sun beat down, and no one stepped forward. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Elias felt the town's eyes on him as he began to move. He didn't want to. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and survival, screamed at him to turn, to mount his mule and disappear back into the solace of the trees, to leave the world of men to its own damnation. But then he saw her shoulders slump, just for a second, a near imperceptible tremor of surrender. The ghosts of Gettysburg screamed in his ears, men he had failed, men he had left behind, men like Sam Vance. He would not leave another soul to be devoured. The crowd parted as he walked through, his heavy boots sounding like a death knell on the dry earth. He stopped before the stage, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. $2. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but it cut through the silence like an axe through deadwood. The auctioneer squinted, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "That you, Thorne? Didn't take you for the marrying kind. You sure you don't want to see what you're buying?" Elias's gaze remained fixed on the motionless figure. "I ain't buying a face," he said, the words coming from a place deeper than thought, loud enough for all to hear. "I'm marrying a person." A profound hush fell. The jeers died in men's throats. This was no longer sport, it was something solemn, something dangerous. The auctioneer, sensing the shift, quickly scribbled on a piece of paper. "So be it. Mr. Elias Thorne enters into a marital contract. Sign here." Elias signed the ledger without looking down. The auctioneer turned to the woman. "You're a wife now, miss. The law requires your name for the record." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. The sackcloth shifted slightly. Then a voice emerged, so soft it was almost stolen by the breeze, a voice laced with the dust of a long, hard road, yet carrying an unbroken core of dignity. "Clara Vance." The name struck Elias like a physical blow. Vance. Sam's last name. The name of the man Jedediah had sworn to avenge. He felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He had just bound himself, by law and before witnesses, to the woman his old enemy had sworn to see hang. His eyes locked onto the sackcloth, searching for an answer that wasn't there. He saw the slight tremor in her hands and knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had not saved her. He had just stepped into the line of fire beside her. He stepped onto the platform, pulled a knife from his belt, and with a single, clean slice, cut the twine binding her wrists. He gestured with his head toward the path leading out of town. "Come on," he said, his voice now a flat, hard thing. As they walked away, the crowd watched in stunned silence. Elias didn't look back, but he could feel Jedediah Kane's stare burning into him from the saloon porch. He had just declared war. The journey to his cabin was steeped in a silence louder than any argument. The trail narrowed, plunging them into the deep green and brown of the forest. Elias walked ahead, leading the mule, every line of his back rigid with 1,000 warring thoughts. He did not speak, did not ask the question that was a burning coal in his gut. "Did you kill him?" Clara followed several paces behind, her bare feet making almost no sound on the packed earth. She moved with a strange grace, a phantom in his wake. At a narrow creek, he stopped to let the mule drink. He filled his canteen and, without turning, left a dipper on a rock near where she stood. He moved away, busying himself with checking the mule's harness, but watched her from the corner of his eye. He saw her kneel, her movements cautious, and lift the dipper. She had to tilt her head at an awkward angle to drink, the rough fabric of the sack scraping against her skin. A flicker of something, pity, anger, confusion, stirred within him, and he crushed it down. He could not afford compassion. Not yet. Not until he knew the truth. They arrived as dusk began to bleed through the trees, turning the sky to bruised purple and orange. The cabin was small, sturdy, built by his own hands, a fortress against the world. He pushed the door open and stepped aside. He didn't look at her, but his words were clear. "You pick where you stand," he said, the sentence heavy with unspoken meaning. "No one's going to place you anymore." Clara hesitated in the doorway for a long moment, a silhouette trapped between the dying light outside and the deep shadows within. Then she stepped inside. Her eyes, hidden from him, seemed to take in the Spartan room in a single glance. The stone hearth, the narrow cot, the table with a single chair. She didn't go to the hearth for warmth, nor the table for rest. She moved to the farthest, darkest corner, sinking down to crouch against the log wall, making herself as small as possible. She drew her knees to her chest, a solitary island of fear. The sackcloth remained her only shield. Elias stood by the door, the signed marriage contract in his pocket feeling as heavy as a tombstone. He looked at the woman in the corner, a woman named Clara Vance, and the forest around them suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage, one they were now both locked inside of. Part 2. the knock of fate. The first night in the cabin was a war fought in silence. Elias took the single cot, not out of comfort, but strategy. It placed him between the door and the corner where Clara remained huddled, a shapeless shadow in the gloom. He lay awake for hours, the worn army pistol he hadn't touched in years now resting on the floor beside him, its cold metal a grim comfort. He listened to her breathing, shallow, controlled, the breathing of someone who had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. He was a fool, a sentimental fool who had let the ghosts of his past steer him into a storm. He could picture Jedediah Kane in the saloon, his voice a low poison, spinning a tale of a black widow temptress who'd murdered his brother. And that brother, Samuel Vance. Elias closed his eyes, and the memory, sharp as shrapnel, returned. A muddy field in the wilderness, rain turning the dirt to a bloody slurry. Sam, barely 19, looking up at him, his eyes wide with surprise and pain, trying to speak around the blood filling his lungs. Sam, who had shared his last piece of hardtack with Elias just that morning. Elias had promised Sam's father he'd look out for him. Another broken promise. And now, the woman accused of killing him was breathing just 10 feet away. The two realities tore at him, leaving him stranded on an island of profound, soul-crushing doubt. Dawn broke, gray and merciless. Elias rose, his movements stiff, and began his routine with the quiet economy of a man long used to solitude. He started a fire, the scrape of flint unnaturally loud. He made coffee, the aroma a scent of normalcy in a situation that was anything but. Clara had not moved. He cooked oatmeal, dividing it into 2 tin bowls. He set one on the table for himself and, after a moment's hesitation, placed the other on the floor a few feet from her. He said nothing. It wasn't kindness. It was a test, a practical gesture. A soldier needed her strength. A killer needed to keep up appearances. He needed to see what she was. He ate with his back to her, every nerve ending alive to the sounds behind him. A long silence, then a faint rustle. The soft scrape of a spoon against tin. He didn't turn. He imagined her lifting the spoon under the suffocating burlap, a small, desperate act of survival. When he finished, he waited. A few minutes later, her empty bowl appeared on the edge of the table, placed there so quietly he barely registered it. This was their language, then. A dialogue of empty bowls and shared silence. For 3 days, the ritual continued. Elias worked outside, felling trees with a controlled fury, channeling his turmoil into the bite of the axe. He split logs until his muscles screamed, the rhythmic impacts a substitute for the questions pounding in his head. On the second morning, he found the wood he'd left piled haphazardly was now neatly stacked, sorted by size. A silent message. I can work. I am not a burden. The next day, he left a pair of worn leather work gloves on the stack. That evening, they were gone. He found them later, tucked neatly beside the woodpile, not taken inside. Another message. I will work, but I will not take what isn't offered freely. The complexity of her silent actions gnawed at him. That night, a new sound broke the routine. A low, guttural growl from the darkness outside, followed by the frantic scratch of claws on wood. A wolf, or perhaps a coyote, drawn by the scent of food. Elias was on his feet in an instant, pistol in hand, moving to the door. From the corner, Clara made a small, choked sound. When he glanced back, She had pressed herself impossibly further into the corner, the embodiment of pure terror. He saw her not as a potential threat, but as a cornered animal. He fired a shot into the air through the open window, and the scratching stopped, replaced by the sound of a creature retreating into the undergrowth. He barred the door and turned. She was still rigid with fear. "It's gone," he said, his voice a rough growl. It was the first time he had spoken to her since the auction. She didn't respond, but after a long while, the tension in her frame seemed to lessen. He had protected her. The thought was unsettling. The next day, Sheriff Brody arrived. He reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, his face a roadmap of compromises. "Thorne," Brody said, not dismounting. "You've caused a firestorm." "I tend my own fire, Sheriff," Elias replied, his hand resting on the axe handle. "Not anymore. Jedediah Kane is pouring fuel on it," Brody countered. "He's in the saloon day and night, buying whiskey and telling stories. Stories about his decorated brother, Samuel Vance, and the venomous woman who lured him in and slit his throat. He's offering a private bounty for any information. He's turning my town into his personal posse." Inside, Clara heard the name, Samuel Vance, spoken aloud. It was a physical blow. The world tilted, the floor seeming to drop away beneath her. This man, her reluctant protector, knew him. The silence between them was no longer just fear and uncertainty. It was now poisoned by a name from her past. Elias's knuckles whitened. What a man does on his own land, with his own wife, is his business. Brody. The word wife hung in the air, a shield he'd forged from $2 and a ghost's promise. Brody sighed. "Legally, maybe. But Kane doesn't care about the law. He cares about what he calls a soldier's justice. I've seen his kind before. He'll provoke you, try to force your hand. He wants a reason to kill you and drag her back. And that judge he's so friendly with? Word is, he's already got the hanging verdict written. This isn't about a trial, Elias. It's about a performance. Is that a warning?" "It's a fact," the sheriff said grimly. "I can hold him off on legal grounds for a while, but I can't stop him from riding out here. You've got less than a month to prove she's not who he says she is. After that, God help you both." Brody rode away, leaving a heavier silence. The fragile truce was broken. Elias's plan to hide, to wait, to observe, had utterly failed. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stared back at the cabin. It was no longer a fortress. It was a siege target. He had willingly brought the enemy to his door. He had to know the truth, not just for his own conscience, but for their very survival. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, his boots heavy with dread. He had to break the silence, because her silence was now a loaded gun pointed at both of their heads. Part 3. The Scar Speaks. Elias walked into the cabin, the heavy finality of Sheriff Brody's warning settling in the small space like a winter chill. He bolted the door, the sound of the latch sliding home echoing like a prison cell closing. Clara was in her corner, a statue of burlap and fear. The time for silent observation was over. It had been a luxury purchased with ignorance, and the price was now coming due. He walked to the hearth, turning to face her, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel both smaller and more threatening. He had to know. He had to hear it from her, one way or the other. "My first patrol in the war," he began, his voice low and raspy. "I was 18. Scared. There was a boy with me, younger still, Samuel Vance. He was a good soldier, honest, followed orders. He's dead now." He let the words hang in the air, heavy as cannon smoke. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, sharp and dangerous. "The sheriff tells me that's the name of the man you're accused of killing, Jedediah Cain's brother. So I'm going to ask you once, and I want the truth. Did you kill him?" The directness of the question seemed to strike her like a physical blow. She flinched, her hands gripping her knees. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. He thought she wouldn't answer, that she would retreat into that impenetrable silence. But then, she lifted her head, the sackcloth shifting with the movement. When her voice came, it was frayed with terror, but underscored with a steely thread of defiance he hadn't heard before. "No." The single word was not a plea. It was a statement. Elias pressed, his own desperation making him cruel. "He just tripped and fell? Is that the story?" He attacked me," she stammered, the words tumbling out as if breaking through a dam of unshed tears. "I fought back. He fell. I ran. So it was an accident." "Yes." Her answers were clipped, defensive. She was giving him nothing more than the barest facts, hoarding the details like a miser. He stood there, torn. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to. But her story was the oldest one in the book, the easiest lie to tell. It was her word against the fierce, vengeful certainty of Jedediah Cain. And Elias, a man who had seen the darkest parts of human nature in the crucible of war, knew that certainty was a powerful weapon. The ghost of Sam Vance stood between them, and Elias's doubt remained, a cold, hard wall. He turned away from her without another word, the silence that rushed back in to fill the void now heavier, colder, and more poisonous than before. Days later, their supplies ran low. The tense quiet of the cabin was beginning to feel like a slow poison, and Elias knew he had no choice but to face the town. The moment he rode into Redemption Gulch, he felt the change. It was a tangible thing. Doors that were usually open were now closed. The blacksmith, who had once shared a drink with him, now found himself intensely busy with a horseshoe as Elias passed. The general store owner, a man named Peters, hesitated when Elias entered. "Just the usual, Peters. Flour, salt, coffee." Peters wrung his hands, his eyes darting towards the street. "Look, Elias, I don't want any trouble. Selling a man's supplies is trouble now. It is when Jedediah Cain is paying for everyone's drinks and telling them you're sheltering a murderer." A voice drawled from the doorway. Elias turned. Cain stood there, blocking the light, his presence filling the small store. He looked Elias up and down, a contemptuous smirk on his face. "You always did have a weakness for strays, Thorne," Cain said, his voice deceptively soft. "Always trying to save things that were already broken. Look where it got you last time. Look where it got Sam." The mention of the name was a deliberate jab. Elias's hand clenched into a fist. "This has nothing to do with that." "It has everything to do with that." Cain's voice sharpened, losing its lazy drawl. "You failed him then, and you're failing his memory now by protecting the whore who killed him. But I'll fix your mistake. I'll see her hang, and if you stand in my way, I will burn you down with her." He took a step closer, his eyes like chips of ice. "Stay out of my way," Elias. Cain turned and walked out, leaving Elias standing in a store that had suddenly become hostile territory. He paid for his supplies and left, the weight of the town's silent judgment heavy on his shoulders. He returned to the cabin in a foul mood, the confrontation with Cain having scraped raw every nerve. He threw the sacks of flour onto the table with a crash that made Clara jump. The frustration and doubt that had been simmering within him finally boiled over. "He's got the whole town eating out of his hand," he snarled, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "They all look at me like I'm a traitor. They all believe him. Why the hell shouldn't I?" The accusation, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air. Clara rose slowly from her corner, her entire body trembling, not with fear, but with a sudden, incandescent rage. "Then why did you buy me?" she cried, her voice cracking with pain. "Why didn't you just leave me on that stage? You should have let one of them take me. It would have been better than this. This cage. Your prisoner. Your doubt." Her words struck him harder than Cain's threats. He had no answer. He had saved her from one prison only to lock her in another. He turned away, unable to look at her, the truth of her words shaming him. She sank back into her corner, the brief fire extinguished, leaving only cold ash. The chasm between them had become a canyon. That night marked a turning point, a quiet, desperate shift in the fabric of their existence. Elias lay on his cot, staring into the darkness, the argument replaying in his mind. He had failed her. He had demanded her trust while offering none of his own. Across the room, Clara sat in the darkness, having reached the absolute end of her endurance. She had run, she had hidden, she had made herself nothing to survive. But she was tired of being nothing. She was tired of the suffocating darkness under the sack, a darkness that was no longer a shield, but a tomb she was carrying on her shoulders. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she reached behind her head and untied the knot. She did not do it for him. She did it for herself. It was an act of surrender, not to him, but to the truth. The coarse fabric slid free. For the first time in months, the cool night air touched her face. Elias must have drifted off, for he awoke to a strange feeling. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, red light through the cabin. And in that light, sitting on the floor before the hearth, was Clara. The sack lay beside her like a shed skin. He saw her face. It was not the face of a monster or a temptress. It was the face of a woman, thin and pale from hardship, but it was the long, brutal scar that stole his breath. It started near her right temple, a vicious, curved line that carved its way down her cheek, ending just above the line of her jaw. It was an old wound, long healed, but its violence was still shockingly present in the dim light. It was not the mark of a fight, it was the mark of a branding, of ownership, of an attempt to claw something away. All the doubt, all the suspicion that had poisoned his mind, evaporated in that single, horrifying instant. The scar was the truth. It was a testament to a violence so profound that no words were necessary. She must have felt his eyes on her, because she turned her head slowly. Her eyes, glassy with unshed tears, met his. She didn't try to hide. There was nothing left to hide behind. Her voice was a whisper, a ghost of sound in the quiet cabin. His name was Samuel Vance. He ran the boarding house. He said he wanted more than just my work for the room and board. She swallowed, her gaze turning to the fire. I said no. He didn't like that. He cornered me in the kitchen. Her hand rose, her fingers tracing the path of the scar without touching it. He did this to me with a broken bottle. Said if he couldn't have my beauty, no one would. I fought back. I pushed him away with all my strength. He was drunk. He stumbled backward. His head, it hit the iron stove. She looked back at Elias, her eyes begging him to believe. I never meant to kill him. I only wanted him to stop. Elias rose from the cot and walked slowly towards her. He knelt in front of her, the embers casting a warm glow on her ravaged face. The question was no longer, did she do it? It was, how in God's name do we prove it? He had shifted from warden to ally, from doubter to believer. His purpose was now forged in the firelight, clear and hard as steel. He had to protect this woman, not from the law, but from the vicious lie that was hunting her. He slowly raised his hand, and with a gentleness that surprised them both, his calloused thumb brushed the undamaged skin just below the end of the scar. He won't touch you again, Elias vowed, his voice low and certain. And neither will his brother. I'll see to it. The battle lines were drawn. The fight for Clara Vance's life had truly begun. Part 4. Two paths, one hope. The dawn that followed the revelation was unlike any that had come before. The air in the cabin, once thick with suspicion and fear, was now clear and still, holding a fragile sense of shared purpose. The sackcloth lay folded in a corner, a relic of a past they had now mutually decided to confront. For the first time, Elias saw Clara in the full morning light, not as a symbol of his own complicated past, but as a person. He watched the way she moved, a quiet efficiency in her actions as she stoked the fire and put coffee on to boil. Her face, even with its brutal scar, set with a grim determination he recognized from his time in the army. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. The silence was no longer a weapon or a shield. It was a space for thought, for planning. They were no longer warden and prisoner, but two soldiers in a besieged fort, studying a map of the battlefield. Over a breakfast of coffee and hardtack, the first real conversation of their strange marriage began. Elias's tone was no longer that of an interrogator, but of a field commander seeking intelligence. "Tell me again," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Everything you remember about that night. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small. A sound, a smell, another person." Clara, looking at him directly for the first time without flinching, began to speak. She recounted the story, her voice steadier now, adding details she had previously locked away. She described the suffocating scent of whiskey on Samuel Vance's breath, the pattern on the wallpaper she had stared at while he cornered her, the way the kitchen door creaked. And then, a crucial detail emerged. "There was someone else there," she said, her eyes distant. "In the scullery, washing dishes. Eleonora. Everyone called her Nora. She was a freedwoman, working for her keep." Elias leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "Did she see what happened?" Clara shook her head, a flicker of the old despair returning. "She saw him drag me into the kitchen. I know she did. I saw her face through the door crack just before he closed it. She looked terrified. After he fell, I ran past the scullery. She was gone. She wouldn't say anything, Elias. Samuel was cruel to her. She was more afraid of him than anyone. A name. A witness. It was a sliver of light in an impossibly dark tunnel. It was everything. Hiding had failed. A direct confrontation with Cain in Redemption Gulch, where he held all the power, was suicide. They needed a weapon that Cain's money and influence couldn't easily bury. A legal, sworn testimony. They needed to find Nora Birch. The new plan began to form, piece by painful piece, built from Elias's tactical mind and Clara's desperate memories. The first and most dangerous step was for Elias to travel to Lockwood, the town where the boarding house stood. It was a 2-day ride, deep into territory where the Vance family name held sway. He would have to go disguised, shedding his identity as the reclusive lumberman and becoming someone else. A drifter, a prospector, anyone unremarkable. The second, and perhaps harder, step was to convince Nora to speak. A terrified woman who had already run once would not be easily persuaded to put her neck in a noose for a stranger. What could they possibly offer her that was worth more than her own life? And while Elias was gone, Clara would be a sitting duck. The cabin was a trap. Cain, relentless and cunning, would surely use Elias's absence to make his move. He would not come alone. Clara had to disappear. Elias knew the woods, its secrets and its hiding places. He thought of the ice cave where a nameless woman had saved his life 3 years ago, a place of warmth and sanctuary carved into the frozen heart of the mountain. It was hidden, defensible, and held a strange, poetic justice. The place where her first act of salvation for him had occurred would now be the place he prepared for hers. The final part of the plan was the most desperate. If Elias could get a signed affidavit from Nora, he would ride it not back to Redemption Gulch, but to the territorial capital, bypassing the corrupt circuit judge entirely and taking their case to a higher, hopefully more impartial, authority. It was a wild gamble, a long shot that depended on a series of miracles. But it was better than waiting for the hangman. The days that followed were a whirlwind of focused activity. A silent understanding flowed between them as they prepared for their separate battles. Elias worked on his disguise, altering an old coat, rubbing dust and grease into his hat until it was unrecognizable. He packed a new identity into his saddlebags: a gold pan, a bedroll, and just enough food for a man down on his luck. Simultaneously, he prepared Clara's sanctuary. He secretly hauled supplies to the hidden cave: blankets, firewood, dried meat, ammunition. He showed her the way, marking a trail only she would recognize. He placed the rifle in her hands, its stock worn smooth, its weight a heavy burden of responsibility. He spent an afternoon teaching her how to load, aim, and fire, his hands briefly touching hers as he adjusted her grip, a current of unspoken trust passing between them. Her hands did not tremble. She learned quickly, her eyes focused, her movements precise. She was no longer the cowering woman from the auction block. The final morning arrived, cold and gray. They stood outside the cabin as the first light filtered through the pines. There were no tears, no grand pronouncements. It was the quiet, tense farewell of 2 soldiers before a battle from which neither might return. He looked at her, at the fierce resolve that had replaced the fear in her eyes, at the scar that was no longer a mark of shame, but a symbol of her will to survive. The cave is small, but the entrance is narrow. No one can get to you if you're watching, he said, his voice low. Don't light a fire during the day. Don't leave the trail. Shoot anything that isn't me. He handed her a small, wrapped package. It was the embroidered handkerchief with the purple flowers she had left for him in the snow all those years ago. You left this behind last time, he said simply. Her fingers closed around it, the one tangible link to the man who had seen her at her most hidden and her most exposed. "Be safe, Elias," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of everything they couldn't say. He nodded once, a sharp, quick gesture. He swung himself into the saddle and, without looking back, spurred his horse towards the east, towards Lockwood. After he was gone, swallowed by the trees, Clara stood for a moment, the rifle in one hand, the handkerchief in the other. Then, with a deep breath, she turned and walked west, towards the mountain, her steps sure and steady on the forest floor. They were separated, vulnerable, and had just gambled their entire future on the courage of a terrified witness and the strength of a love forged in silence and scars. The plan was in motion. There was no turning back. Part 5. The Siege Under the Sunset. The town of Lockwood smelled of coal smoke and secrets. It was larger, grimmer than Redemption Gulch, a place where industry had begun to chew away at the edges of the frontier. Elias, now a haggard prospector with a convincing limp and a story about a played-out claim, moved through its underbelly like a ghost. He avoided the main streets where the Vance family's influence was a palpable force, instead haunting the laundries, the back-alley saloons, and the crowded tenements where the town's invisible population lived and worked. For 2 days, he asked careful, oblique questions, speaking of a cousin who had worked at the Ridley house, trying to catch a flicker of recognition at the name Nora Birch. He was met with blank stares and suspicious silence. The trail was cold, and the clock was ticking. Every hour he spent here was an hour Clara was alone, an hour closer to the judge's arrival. Desperation began to gnaw at him. On the 3rd day, following a whispered tip from an elderly woman mending clothes, he found himself outside a grim, soot-stained boarding house for factory workers. He found her in the laundry room in the basement, a place of steam, lie, and endless, back-breaking labor. Eleanora Birch was thinner than Clara had described, her face etched with a permanent exhaustion, her hands raw and red from the scalding water. When Elias said Clara's name, Nora's eyes widened in terror, and she dropped the sheet she was wringing. "I don't know anyone by that name," she whispered, turning away, her entire body language a plea for him to leave. "Please, mister, I don't want any trouble." Elias moved to block her exit, his voice low and urgent, not threatening, but deeply sincere. "Trouble has already found her," he said. "Her name is Clara Vance, and she's going to hang for a crime she didn't commit unless you help her. She told me you saw what happened." Nora began to tremble, shaking her head violently. "I saw nothing. Samuel Vance. He was a good man. His family is important here." The lie was brittle, pathetic. Elias saw the terror in her eyes, the same terror he had seen in Clara's. He reached into his coat. For a terrifying second, Nora thought he was pulling a gun, but instead, he produced the small, embroidered handkerchief. He held it out on his calloused palm. "This is who you're saving," he said softly. "She's not a murderer. She's a woman who fought back. Just like you've been fighting your whole life, I'd wager. You ran from Lockwood to be free of the Vances. But you're not free, are you? You're still their prisoner, right here in this basement. Fear is your warden." He looked her in the eye, his gaze unwavering. "Jedediah Kane wants to hang her. But what he's really doing is sending a message to every woman who thinks of saying no. You have a choice, Nora. You can stay in this prison for the rest of your life, or you can pick up a pen, tell the truth, and set 2 women free today. He held her gaze for a long, silent moment. Tears began to well in Nora's eyes, tears of fear, anger, and years of suppressed injustice. With a shuddering breath that seemed to wrench itself from her very soul, she gave a single, decisive nod. Back in the mountains, the forest held its breath. Jedediah Kane was a man unaccustomed to waiting. Elias Thorne's absence had stretched from a curiosity into a suspicion. Kane's instincts, honed on the battlefield and the bounty trail, screamed that something was wrong. Leaving 2 of his hired guns to watch the town, he took 3 others and rode out to the lumberman's cabin. He found it empty, cold, a week's worth of dust coating the surfaces. But Kane was a predator. He circled the property, his eyes missing nothing. He found the faint tracks leading away from the cabin, too light to be a man's, heading not for the town, but for the mountain. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. She was running. He lived for the hunt. Clara had made the cave a home. She kept the fire small, its smoke barely visible. During the day, she sat near the entrance, hidden in the shadows, the heavy rifle across her lap, watching the forest. She was not the same woman. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now tempered by a hard, clear resolve. She was a survivor. She would fight. She saw them before she heard them, 4 figures moving through the trees with a hunter's patience. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady on the rifle. Kane stopped his men at the edge of the clearing below the cave. "Clara Vance!" His voice boomed, echoing off the rocks. "Your protector has flown. He's left you to die, just like he left my brother in the mud. Come on out, and I'll make it quick. A rope is better than starving in a hole." Clara remained silent, sighting down the barrel of the rifle. He was trying to bait her. Kane grew impatient. "Fine. We'll come in and get you." He motioned for 2 of his men to circle around the rocks. As the first man broke cover, a deafening crack shattered the silence. A chip of rock exploded from the boulder just inches from his head. He yelped and scrambled back into the trees. A second shot kicked up dirt at the feet of the other. The message was clear. The prey had teeth. The siege began in earnest. For hours, they exchanged fire. Kane's men were undisciplined, their shots wild. Clara's were measured, precise, aimed not to kill, but to pin down, to conserve the precious ammunition. But they were relentless. They began to climb the rocks, using the terrain for cover, getting closer. The narrow entrance was her advantage, but they were 4 against 1. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. She knew she couldn't hold out through the night. Just as one of Kane's men found a new angle and prepared to rush the entrance, a new sound joined the fray, the thunder of hoofbeats and a familiar, furious yell. Elias, riding his horse like a demon, burst from the trees, his face a mask of cold fury, a pistol in each hand. The fight turned into a brutal, chaotic melee. Elias's arrival scattered Kane's men, his shots accurate and deadly. One man went down, then another. The third fled into the forest. Suddenly, it was just the 2 of them, Elias and Kane, circling each other in the fading light, the ghosts of the war finally rising between them. "You should have stayed out of it, Thorne." Kane snarled, firing a shot that grazed Elias's arm. "She was my justice." "You call this justice?" Elias yelled back, diving behind a boulder as a bullet whizzed past his ear. Hunting a terrified woman? Sam would be ashamed of you. The name enraged Cain. He charged, his gun empty, pulling a long hunting knife. The final confrontation was not one of skill, but of pure, unrestrained violence. They crashed together, trading blows that were meant to cripple and kill. It was the culmination of years of resentment, a fight over a dead man and a living woman. Elias, wounded and exhausted from his ride, was on the defensive. Cain, fueled by a righteous, mad grief, pressed his attack. He slashed Elias across the ribs, and Elias staggered back, a gasp of pain escaping his lips. As Cain raised the knife for the final blow, a shot rang out, not from Elias's gun, but from the cave entrance above. Cain froze, a look of utter surprise on his face. He looked down to see a dark stain spreading across his chest. He turned his head, his disbelieving eyes finding Clara, who stood at the mouth of the cave, the rifle smoking in her hands, her face resolute. Cain crumpled to the ground, the fight finally gone from him. Silence descended upon the forest, broken only by the ragged sound of breathing. The battle was over. Elias, clutching his side, looked up at the cave. Clara slowly lowered the rifle and emerged into the twilight, her eyes locked on his. He stumbled towards the base of the rocks, his legs threatening to give out. She scrambled down to meet him. They came together in the clearing, the space between them finally closing. He was bleeding, she was covered in grime and gunpowder, but they had survived. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was Nora's affidavit, signed and sealed. He pressed it into her hand. It was their proof, their hope, their future. They had won. Part 6. Dawn on the Promised Land. The silence that followed the final gunshot was profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the pines and the ragged gasps of the living. For a moment, Elias and Clara simply stood in the twilight clearing, two survivors amidst the wreckage of their past, the space between them charged with exhaustion, relief, and an unspoken truth. Then, the pain from his wounds registered, and Elias staggered, his hand clutching the bleeding gash on his ribs. Clara was at his side in an instant, her previous terror replaced by a focused, urgent calm. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress and pressed it firmly against the wound, her touch sure and steady. "We need to get you back to the cabin," she said, her voice clear and commanding. He shook his head, his gaze locking with hers. "No. The cabin was a place to hide. We're done hiding." He pushed himself upright, leaning on her for support, a reversal of the roles they had played for so long. Now, she was his strength. With painstaking slowness, they made their way down the mountain, not back to the isolation of their besieged fortress, but towards the world of men, towards the town that had judged and condemned them. They rode into Redemption Gulch under the cold light of a rising moon, a grim and defiant procession. Elias, pale and slumped in his saddle, one arm held tight against his side. Clara, sitting tall on his second horse, her face unhidden, her scar a testament to the truth, the rifle resting across her lap. Their arrival was a spectacle that stopped the town in its tracks. Men spilled out of the saloon, their faces a mixture of shock and awe. This was not the frightened ghost they had whispered about, nor the broken-down hermit they had shunned. These were two warriors returning from a battle. They went straight to the sheriff's office. Brody, hearing the commotion, met them at the door, his eyes widening at the sight of Elias's wounds and the grim set of Clara's jaw. "Cain," Elias managed to say, his voice strained. He came for her. On my land. He unslung a saddlebag and dropped it on the sheriff's desk. It held Kane's knife and pistol. Then, Clara stepped forward and placed the folded, signed affidavit beside them. "This is the truth of what happened in Lockwood," she said, her voice ringing with an authority no one in that town had ever heard from her. "And the men he brought with him are up on the mountain. This is the truth of what happened tonight." Sheriff Brody stood for a long moment, looking from the evidence on his desk to the two battered but unbroken people before him. He saw the truth not just on the paper, but in their eyes. This was his crossroads, the moment he chose between the easy path of a corrupt system and the hard road of real justice. He picked up the affidavit, his decision made. "I'll get the doctor for you, Thorne," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound respect. "Then, at first light, I'm writing this to the territorial marshal myself. The circuit judge can go to hell." The weeks that followed were a quiet crucible of healing. The doctor patched Elias up, but it was Clara who nursed him. She cleaned and dressed his wounds with a gentle competence, using her knowledge of herbs to brew teas that fought the fever. In the long hours of his recovery, they finally spoke, not of the violence and the fear, but of the lives they had lived before. He told her of a childhood in the green hills of Vermont, a world away from the dust and blood of the West. She told him of her mother, who had taught her to embroider the small, purple flowers he had kept for so long. They were no longer just two survivors sharing a space. They were two souls building a home. The cabin, once a symbol of their siege, became a place of convalescence and connection. And slowly, the town began to change. With Kane's malign influence gone, and the sheriff's official report backing Elias's story of self-defense, the tide of public opinion began to turn. Guilt and shame replaced suspicion. Peters, the store owner, left a crate of goods on their porch with a scrawled note of apology. The blacksmith reshod their horses for free. They were small gestures, but they were the threads that began to stitch Elias and Clara back into the fabric of a community. One afternoon, weeks after the fight, Sheriff Brody rode up to the cabin. He wasn't in a hurry. He dismounted, holding a single, official-looking envelope. He handed it to Clara. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Elias stood beside her, his arm, now mostly healed, resting lightly on her shoulder. The words were written in a clear, decisive hand. "All charges against Clara Vance are hereby dismissed. The warrant for her arrest is rescinded. The case is officially closed." She read the words 3 times, her eyes tracing the letters as if they were a sacred text. Her name. It was hers again, clean and unburdened. She didn't cry. Instead, a slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile so pure and bright it seemed to light up the entire clearing. She was free. That evening, as the sun set, they sat on the porch. Clara held the objects that had defined her journey: the official letter of pardon, the coarse burlap sack, and the small, embroidered handkerchief. Elias watched her as she ran her fingers over the rough fabric of the sack. "Funny," she said, her voice soft. "This thing used to be my whole world, a world of shame." He laced his fingers through hers. "And now?" She looked from the sack to the handkerchief, then to the letter. "Now," she said, "it's just a piece of cloth. It's a reminder that I survived being made into nothing. This," she touched the handkerchief, "is a reminder that there was always a spark of hope. And this," her fingers rested on the letter, is the proof that the truth matters. She folded them all together, not as burdens to be hidden, but as artifacts of a history she had overcome. A few weeks later, they held a wedding. Not in a church, but right there, under a great oak tree on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't the grim transaction of the auction block, it was a celebration. Sheriff Brody stood as a witness. Peters and his wife brought a freshly baked pie. And in a testament to the profound reach of their story, Eleanora Birch was there, having used the money Elias had given her to start a new life in a new town. She had traveled back just to see the woman she had helped set free. Clara wore a simple dress of blue muslin she had sewn herself. She wore no veil. Her scar was visible in the afternoon sun, a mark not of shame, but of victory. Elias, his side now healed to a dull ache, stood beside her, his eyes full of a love and peace he never thought he would find. Their vows were simple words, spoken only to each other, promises of shared sunrises and a quiet, steadfast companionship. As they stood there, hand in hand, looking out at the vast wilderness, it was no longer a place to hide from the world, but a place to build one. It was their home, a sanctuary earned not through isolation, but through courage, truth, and a love that had refused to be silenced. Conclusion: the legacy of the scar. Sevens. Thus, the story of Elias Thorne and Clara Vance comes to a close. It began not with a glance or a dance, but with a $2 bid for a woman hidden from the world, a ghost shrouded in burlap and shame. What followed was a journey not across the vast and unforgiving frontier, but through the even more treacherous wilderness of the human heart. It was a path fraught with the ghosts of war, the poison of suspicion, and the relentless pursuit of a vengeful past. Yet, on that path, a reclusive soldier haunted by the men he couldn't save learned to fight for the one woman he could, and a victim who had been made invisible to the world found the courage to reclaim her face, her name, and her story. Their tale teaches us a profound lesson of the West, that true sight has nothing to do with the eyes. It is the ability to look past the deepest scars, the ugliest rumors, and the most terrifying facades to see the unwavering truth of a person's soul. Their love story was not forged in whispered promises under the moonlight, but hammered out in the harsh light of day, through shared danger, steadfast loyalty, and the quiet, revolutionary act of choosing to believe. It proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in a lucky gold strike, but in the steadfast heart of another. Thank you for riding alongside Elias and Clara on their journey to justice and peace. If you believe that courage is the only currency that truly matters, and that even the most broken things can be mended with love, then we ask you to support our telling of these tales. Please like this story, share it with anyone who loves a tale of the untamed heart, and be sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. Don't forget to tap the bell so you never miss a new adventure. Until next time, ride steady, love deep, and remember, the harshest prisons are the ones we build for ourselves, but the key is always forged in the heart of another.